This episode was recorded on the unceded lands of the Kulin Nation.
Hello and welcome to POSLink Plus Listen, Living Positive Victoria's podcast by and about people living with HIV. My name is Jen Johnson from Living Positive Victoria. For this episode, I had the pleasure of chatting with Graham Brown, known to many as Professor Graham Brown, and we spoke about how Graham's HIV journey led him to becoming one of Australia's most well-known and well-regarded HIV-positive researchers. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Welcome, Graham, to POSLink Plus Listen. It's great to see you.
Thanks, Jen. It's fantastic to be here.
So I want to start by asking you, what was your relationship with HIV before your diagnosis?
Right. So that would take us back to around, I was about 24, 25, so mid-90s. And I'd actually started to be involved with the youth program, the WA/AIDS Council. In fact, before that, in high school, I advocated for one of the first high schools in Australia to do HIV education.
Oh, this is the good stuff.
Back in, that would have been, 1985. So well before any of the big national campaigns.
Oh, there has to be a story there.
Yeah,
Can you tell us a bit more about that?
I was a pretentious member on the school council and I felt this was a big issue, and because there was lots of drama and lots of media about it, very little understanding around it being connected around gay men or anything like that. But I just felt our school needed to be engaging around it because it was mostly engaged around teenage pregnancy.
Okay.
And I said, we need to look at STIs and HIV. So, we got some education up and running. Looking back, it was atrocious.
To be fair, much of it was at the time.
It was stigmatising at every level. Anyway, but I actually do remember thinking, and even when the big, different campaigns came out, the really stigmatising early ones, thinking, I wonder if this is ever really going to impact on me. Jump forward.
And was there an awareness at the time? I mean, there's obviously an association at the time with gay men. Was that something that you were particularly connecting with, or were you just trying to diversify the conversation?
Certainly by 15, 16, I knew I was gay, but I certainly wasn't out in those years. So we're talking like mid-80s there. But there was the level of knowledge was so limited that I think in the back of my mind there was almost a fait accompli of, if I come out, I will get then AIDS. Yeah, was kind of
They were connected.
That was definitely connected. It was definitely part of that situation, that path, that kind of thing. But as I got older into uni, obviously the knowledge got a lot better. But I actually got involved with the youth program, the gay youth programs at the WA/AIDS Council, more on the basis of mental health and suicide prevention. Was really the driver. So I was volunteering as part of that while I was starting to work within health promotion generally in other organisations. And then an opportunity came up. We were heavily involved developing a whole lot of youth programs, advocating for a lot of the gay youth stuff to be actually gay and lesbian, which at that time was progressive. So it would have been just after started, so I got a position at the WA's Council as one of the youth project workers. The other part, I did have a good friend that was diagnosed with HIV about a year before I started working at the AIDS Council. Okay. That impacted a lot. That was when it all started to feel very, very real.
Very close.
Yeah.
Okay. So can you tell us a bit about your experience around the time that you were diagnosed?
So I like to celebrate. I always took my work very, very seriously. So, as an example, within 3
Why the
months.
past tense, Graham?
So, well, yeah, that's true. So, when I was working at the Arthritis Foundation, my first sort of health promotion job after studying at uni and so on, within 3 months, I fell down a flight of stairs, did my ankles in, and became evident that, I had to do a whole lot of things. Otherwise, I was going to end up with rheumatoid arthritis and so forth. And osteoarthritis and so on. So there was a couple of other jobs who always seemed within 3 months. So, within...
So by taking work seriously, you mean oddly deterministic?
Yeah. So
Okay.
3 months
See where
after
this
I
is going.
started working at the AIDS Council, I was diagnosed with HIV,
Okay.
which was, I have to admit, it came to me as a shock and a surprise. I knew all the context and so forth. I was actually in a relationship with seeing someone who I knew to be HIV positive. We thought we were doing everything right. And to be honest, my reaction was like, this is an administrative stuff up. Not actual administrative, but just cosmic wise.
Okay.
I felt at the time I'd made all my decisions about what I wanted to do in life, and it was all about social change and justice, and I'd made all these decisions. So it kind of felt like, well, why am I getting HIV if I've made all my life decisions?
Was this cleared with upper management?
Yeah, exactly. So the order of it seemed wrong. Anyway, the other challenge was I was already working in the organisation that was the main organisation providing peer support and other sorts of support for people living with HIV, and that was an unusual feeling.
Why so?
Well, it was. I had a number of colleagues. Some were HIV positive, some weren't, but that were very much services for people newly diagnosed and so forth. And I wasn't sure I wanted to actually change my relationship with them. I didn't. It was a strange sort of circumstance because I was also working with them. I was on committees with the main HIV doctors in Perth at the time. It was a very kind of strange situation. So I thought about that for a couple of weeks and then decided, well, I certainly wasn't going to buy into the challenges of feeling worried about trying to hide my status. I was incredibly privileged to be in an organisation where, let's face it, they weren't allowed to have a problem.
Yep.
So I actually disclosed it to all the staff as a part of an agenda item at the staff meeting.
Okay. Just paint a brief picture, please.
So I spoke to my friend who was chair of the staff meeting and who I'd already disclosed to and said, look, my preference would be to tell everyone all at once. And I said, look, to be honest, it's not about, it's not so much about drama, but I don't want to have to work through reactions one by one. And I'd just rather everyone know and we kind of move on. So I did a bit of a, wrote it out what I was going to say. Mainly it was around being clear about why I was being open and that I wasn't expecting others to if there were others in the same situation. But I wanted to be able to, if I wanted to access services, I wanted to be able to do it without any concerns. And anyone having to be sort of quiet or secret or anything like that. So that was the main thing. I just thought, it's going to be easier if everyone just knows. I was in a very privileged situation, I think, in terms of I knew my close friends would be okay eventually. I knew that they cared a lot about me. By then I told my parents, and I was privileged enough to never be in a situation where I wasn't going to, if that makes sense. Like I knew they would be able to deal with it, respond to it and so forth. So that was the context.
So you describe a situation.
It's not saying I wasn't absolutely terrified.
And I imagine a lot of thought and time was taken to get to that decision. But I notice you're describing a situation where you go from being a member of a workforce, a team member, and you're moving into potentially also accessing services and becoming a service user. Is that sort of what you were looking to get ahead of how you might navigate that, given that?
Yeah, it was. I knew there were. I mean, I'd been working in the space long enough to know that now, particularly at that stage, sort of mid-90s, we were. To put it in context, 1994 was the year that Australia had the highest number of people pass away from HIV.
Mm-hmm.
That was the context I was joining the organisations and the response. It was about 6 months before the conference that announced about combination treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the other thing is what was probably the biggest wake-up call I got was I do think part of my reaction was I didn't think I would get HIV.
Yep.
And the very fact that I was working in social justice and a whole range of areas and yet had that reaction was enlightening.
So 1996, it's before combination therapies are available. Did you start any of the treatments that were available around the time that you were diagnosed?
So I suppose to give context, there was a lot of conflicting information at the time. There was as much evidence to say don't start treatment straight away because of the side effects and see how far you can go. At the same time, there was evidence coming through of a kind of treat it early, treat it hard kind of approach. Yeah. So then there was starting to be evidence that if you treat early, it minimises the impact and damage. Mm. So I believe that part of the reason I think I went into treatment straight away was a sense of if I do this, it was sort of like a part of taking back control. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to do something that I felt I'm, fighting back against this and I'm not going to let it change all my plans and so forth. So I went straight on to treatment. It was hideous. It was large Barocca-sized tablets made of what felt like chalk, and you meant to crush that up, put it in water and drink it every morning an hour before you had anything else to eat or drink. So, and things like that. It was just, which at a time of like only a couple of weeks earlier I'd been diagnosed was like, probably a bit of a rush and a bit quick. So I lasted about a month on that and went, no, given I'm thinking there's as much evidence to say not to go on treatment as there is.
Yep.
So it was about a month or two, I was like, I can't do this. I was AZT was part of it, which had all the headaches. It was pretty hideous.
Yeah.
So I stopped. Then it was much later that year that my whole system started to deteriorate really quite quickly.
Wow.
And I had an illness that was more significant than the seroconversion illness, which I'd originally thought was just the flu.
Yep.
And my viral load sort of went through the roof and my CD4 count was plummeting and so forth. So that was when I decided to go onto treatment, but this was at least 4 months after combination treatment had been sort of recognised and so on.
Okay.
So things started to turn around. The treatments still weren't great, but there was no more crushing up chalk.
Yeah.
So I'm in.
Great. All right. So just curious to ask what made you decide to move into research?
It's interesting. There's a couple of things. So I was fortunate about, it's probably just on 6 months after I was diagnosed. I met a pretty amazing fellow who I'm still with.
Oh.
Yes.
True love.
Yeah.
That's the thing.
So amazing who I was fortunate at a very early stage. I mean, it's kind of weird. I think I was probably at the best psychologically about relationships, the best I'd ever been in terms of it was probably the first time in my life I was really comfortable with where I was at, being single, all of that, feeling good about, even though I recently got HIV, it was sort of, recalibrated a whole lot of things.
Yeah.
which I think has a lot to do with then the kind of signals you send out and the kind of person,
Yep.
you're sort of more open to healthy relationships and things. So I know this does come back to the research.
I have every faith.
So I was actually starting to feel, on one hand, good about where I was going, but on the other hand, in the back of my mind, there was a strong thing of kind of almost like a heavy logic basis of, okay, I'm 25, probably got 10 years. These treatments are pretty new. What do I want to achieve by the time I'm 35? Met a great guy, tick. Number two was I was frustrated with the sort of research that was happening. It didn't feel particularly relevant for the work that I was doing within the AIDS Council and the community programs and so on. So I started to get involved with some of the research studies that were happening but within my position at the AIDS Council. That moved into an idea of, okay, I want to get my PhD by the time I'm 35. I'm not entirely sure why, but I just did. So it was a two thing of, one, I wanted to get more involved with research just as a passion, but I wasn't happy with the research that was happening.
Yep.
So that's sort of what then started to drive the connections.
So what was it like? I mean, what was it like to make a shift into a research environment? You've come from an environment where, the context is HIV. There are other positive folks there and an understanding of HIV. What was it like navigating a shift into a space where HIV perhaps wasn't at the centre?
Yeah. So how would you give context? I was at the AIDS Council for about another 5 years, getting more and more involved in some of the research that was happening nationally and so on.
So you made that shift through community?
Yeah, through community.
Research.
But it was around 2001, 2002 that I took up an academic position at a university in Perth. And that was a shift in terms of, I'd been almost 8 years within a HIV organisation and moving then to a research centre within a school of public health where HIV was part of the picture, but only part.
Yep.
It was interesting. It was a safe environment for both being queer and being HIV positive, that within colleagues and so forth, that wasn't an issue. But one of the things that I think I found challenging was, because I'd come from community, when I was doing research in HIV, it was seen as being a peer researcher, which is great, but then it's sort of somehow it's not always seen as the same as just being a researcher, if you know what I mean. Like, it was sort of there was a tone.
Can you explain that thinking?
So some of it would be...
As best you understand it.
Yeah, as best I understood it. Certainly at that time, there was a sense that someone doing research in, say, social research in HIV that wasn't living with HIV might be seen as somewhat less biased, and they may, would be able to look at things more objectively. My argument was that objectivity meant they were cutting themselves off from a whole lot of insight. So it's more a sense of bringing a range of perspectives and insights to the research is what it actually needed. Fortunately, most of my colleagues were pretty strong on the basis that very little research is completely unbiased.
Yeah.
The very fact that you want to research something shows
the very fact that you're alive.
Yeah, it's just not. Yeah. So that was good. A couple of the challenges did then start to evolve where as I moved up and was doing more national studies and so forth, balancing the advocacy role that I was wanting to play plus the research role. And it's a fine line. And so, because often as a researcher, I was being asked to present and speak my opinion on different things around social policy, around HIV policy, sexual health policy, and so forth. What I was, I suppose, able to do was I did get quite heavily involved with some of the national community HIV organisations and the peak bodies and so forth. And through that, ended up being on was asked to be on some of the Commonwealth advisory committees and so forth, in a way that enabled me to be able to have a very strong advocacy role in a format that the universities understood, if that makes sense. And so, I think I found it a healthy balance, I think, in that sense.
So there was less of a sense that engaging in that kind of activism was a threat to your kind of objectivity as a researcher.
It was something that that the discipline of the university could see as engagement and service to the community and that sort of thing. So it was always just a bit of a balancing act.
Yeah. Has much changed since you were first encountering this balancing act from where you are today? Yeah. Still working in research?
Yeah, look, I think a lot has changed in terms of over that period. I think the strength and the credibility of positive voices within across the entire HIV response and in other areas is a couple of areas. One is much more respected and acknowledged. I think it's the experience of positive people and the building up of strong voices, I think is enabling a lot more, I was going to say nuance, but I think probably a better way would be more persuasive. The other thing that has shifted is the quality of the advocacy and so forth, I think is stronger. But the other big shift is the openness and the respect coming from the audience of the advocacy, shall we say. Certainly within bureaucrats within government, other researchers, institutions and so forth. One of the things we know is that HIV is seen as one of the leading areas of getting meaningful engagement of people with the condition, so with HIV, involved in the response at all levels. Now that takes a lot of work, but certainly the respect and almost expectation of that is what I find now, where I didn't previously. I suppose a good example would be, I won't say which committee, but I was on a fairly senior committee, government committee, and the chair basically said the meeting can't go ahead because key people with HIV, who were the minority of the committee, weren't going to be able to participate. And so the meeting had to be rescheduled because they were decisions that could not happen without their involvement. The big shift there was having, strong, high-up people willing to take a stand that did not require people with HIV to jump up and down for what is good practice.
Yeah, that's an incredible, and that I imagine wasn't enshrined in kind of the rules of the the committee.
Yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. I think I've certainly noticed more and more in recent years the idea of lived experience and the valuing of lived experience across a whole range of areas of kind of health and well-being. And it's been something in the HIV zone that we've been doing for a really long time, but it is, it's interesting to see just how much I think it's been happening in a lot of places in different ways for a really long time, but it's really getting recognised in new ways.
I think the other significant change has been a credibility and expectation of the diversity of positive voices. So we're well past the time where, positive voices were primarily white gay men. We're well past that space, and the expectation is that the diversity of voices is what we actually need going forward.
Absolutely. So, Graham, how does that play out within the research work that you are doing these days?
Yeah. Look, it's been interesting being someone living with HIV within research and that being known as it's part of my profile and profession and so on. I've had to do a lot of work to advocate that having someone working within a research team living with HIV does not represent the diversity of people living with HIV. And in fact, I'd also argue the very fact that I'm working day in, day out as a researcher kind of, shall we say, skews my view of the world. And so while I believe I bring an important perspective, it's me being there is not consultation with the body positive, with people living with HIV. I'll regularly advocate that and state that, for example, organisations that are working with, say, even peer navigators, have a much broader perspective of the diversity of people living with HIV and all the people they're working with than I will, where it's limited to those people I happen to know and, should we say, the data that I see. And so that's been quite important. I think a balancing aspect of doing research as a peer does not mean you represent the entire peer experience.
You talked about balance before. It sounds like, early in your career, you're navigating a balance where you're having to sort of push back against this perception that because of your HIV positive experience, you're unable to be objective, you're biased as a researcher. But what you just described is sort of the opposite of that. It's like, well, because of your HIV positive status, you are able to speak on behalf of all HIV positive people. So that's great,
Yes.
I don't know. I just, that really stood out as being.
That would be accurate. And I do think that probably reflects a lot of the challenges, the advocacy and the battles we've had with HIV, the challenges and the battles we're having in the 80s and 90s are quite different to the ones now. And it's about, it's almost like a pendulum that goes different ways, that we just need to find the right mix.
Not just recognising diversity, but actually activating it wherever we're doing this work.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Graham Brown, you have been living with HIV for 27 years. You said earlier that there was a time when you didn't imagine that you'd live beyond age 35, and here you are. So what is next for you, Graham?
Yeah, it's interesting. I have to admit, it was probably when I hit 40 that I realised, you know what, I really can think long term. I don't think I ever didn't, but it was just a sort of in the back of your mind. So, my long-term plans were always only 5 years.
Okay, yeah.
If you know what I mean. So, it was like, this is in for the long haul. In terms of going forward, one of the things I suppose I feel is I probably every few years feel more and more confident about being both a researcher, an activist, and HIV positive. I feel more confident now about, I suppose, both sharing what I've learned through that whole experience and the kind of policy changes we achieved and all sorts of things we achieved to make things better. Both sharing that across broader communities, but also learning so much more about the sorts of expectations and changes I think we could still be achieving. There's, for example, a lot of work I'm doing around HIV and quality of life. And that's both, I suppose, the research and the learnings even I've gotten myself in sense of what that's really about. And that quality of life really is about, improving someone's quality of life is an outcome of reducing stigma, is an outcome of improving access to healthcare, an outcome of increasing social connection. That's really what that's about. And so what I feel quite, I suppose, enthusiastic and looking forward to is a focus on, how should I put it, the positive outcomes than just a focus on the negative inputs, if that makes sense.
Yep.
It's kind of, I feel like now when we talk about stigma, when we talk about discrimination, it's because we want a better world, not just to focus on the bad things that are happening because of that stigma and discrimination.
Well, Graham, it has been so wonderful to talk with you today about your journey of living with HIV and about the work that you've done and about the incredible contribution that you have made over a great many years. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Jen. It's been fantastic.
Did you enjoy this episode of POSLink Plus Listen? You can find more episodes on our website or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date. For more information, head to lpv.org.au and join us on our social channels.